My name is Patrick Pops Garrett. I am the founder and chief drinking officer of Bourbon and Banter. And I hope you guys are ready for a fun evening of bourbon and banter and a little bit of tasting. So Bourbon and Banter is a whiskey and bourbon media company that specializes in industry news, whiskey reviews, and, well, whiskey education like we're going to have tonight. So once again, I'm really honored to be here for this wonderful event. And with that said, let's go ahead and get the show started. First and foremost, I want to make sure that you each have out everything you need for this tasting tonight. In your sample tasting kit, you should have received 3 samples of whiskey, some tasting cups, along with our bourbon flavor wheel and our tasting mat. So if you haven't done so already, please go ahead, put your tasting mat out, put those sample cups down, and make sure you've filled those glasses of whiskey, because there's 2 things that will make you cry during a whiskey tasting. And the first one is spilling your whiskey. So let's make sure we don't do that and pour those out. I'd like to draw your attention then to the bourbon flavor wheel. This is a visual tasting aid we created years ago to help you as you're tasting the whiskey tonight to identify the flavors and the aromas that you may experience. Keep in mind, this is not an answer key, right? This isn't a test, so there's no right answers, there's no wrong answers. So as we go through the tasting this evening, if you don't smell or taste anything on this flavor wheel, that's okay, all right? If all you taste is a little bit of alcohol, well, just blow in your glass a little bit. And if you taste and smell things that aren't on this list, that's okay as well. Because remember, taste is subjective and it's rooted in experience. Because at the end of the day, if you've never had cotton candy, well, you can't really tell me what cotton candy tastes like. So with that being said, let's also now give you a few tips that's going to maximize your tasting experience this evening. First and foremost, this is not a wine tasting. I'm sure you've all been to wine tastings before. And what do they do at a wine tasting? They tell you to stick your nose way down into that glass and take a big whiff, but please don't do that. We're going to keep an open mind and an open mouth. So as we smell the whiskeys this evening, you're going to keep your nose above your little cup and you're going to keep your mouth open and you're going to breathe in. Not only will this protect your sense of smell and your sense of taste, it will allow you to smell the whiskey better. And once again, protecting that sense of smell is important, because the number 2 thing that will make you cry at a whiskey tasting, well, it's not being able to taste the whiskey. So we want to make sure you have a good time tonight. The other thing is we're going to look at the whiskey, we're going to smell it, we're going to taste it. Let me drive the pace, so please don't skip ahead. I know it's very tempting, but let's just follow my lead. And then lastly, try the whiskey neat first. As the master distiller intended, no water, no ice. Let's taste it that way. Then after that, it's your whiskey. If you want to put a drop or 2 of water in to see how it opens up the aroma, opens up the flavor, that's fantastic. Add a single ice cube to see how that chilled dilution affects it, even better. It's your whiskey, drink it how you want. And hey, if you don't like it, you can dump it, you can give it to a friend. They're always happy to get that. So that being said, let's go and go into the first part of the 101, which is the education. Everyone always asks me, hey, Patrick, what is the difference between bourbon and whiskey? Are they even the same thing? Well, we start with understanding what is whiskey. Whiskey is a distilled spirit made from a fermented mash of grains, okay? And mash basically is recipe. So grains, wheat, barley, rice, corn, all right? Those get fermented and mashed up, and then they get distilled, and we have whiskey. You know, if you take sugarcane and did the same thing, you'd get rum. So rum, whiskey are different things. Bourbon, therefore, is just a style of whiskey. Bourbon, Scotch, Irish, Japanese, Canadian, all styles of whiskey, all part of that big whiskey family. Okay, so bourbon is just a unique one. So at the end of the day, all bourbons are whiskey, but not all whiskeys are bourbons. So that said, what makes bourbon so unique? What makes it so special, and why is it so popular right now? Well, the first thing is bourbon has to be made in the United States. Now, there's a common myth that says bourbon has to be made in Kentucky. Well, it's not true. It can be made anywhere in the United States, but 95% of the world's bourbon is produced in the great state of Kentucky. Now, according to a recent survey, 110% of Kentuckians said, well, all the good stuff is made in Kentucky. Well, once again, that's a subjective statement, but a lot of it is. The other 5% made in a rapidly growing network of independently owned and craft distillers around the rest of the United States. Now, what else makes bourbon unique? Well, it has to consist of at least 51% corn in that mash bill, that grain recipe. All right, that brings a lot of sweetness to it. It's one of the reasons some Scotch drinkers think bourbon is too sweet, at least 51% corn. The next thing is the bourbon. When it finally gets put into a barrel, it has to be a brand new charred oak barrel, meaning that once that barrel is empty, it can never be used to make bourbon again. So we ship them off to Scotland and Ireland and Japan because they can use a used barrel to make their whiskey. Just another difference between the two types. Next thing is when we distill this whiskey, off the still no higher than 160 proof, because we want to leave a lot of flavors and chemical compounds that make bourbon what it is today. You go much higher, get into 190 proof, well, you get into vodka territory, no color, no taste, no flavor. And well, whiskey drinkers, we don't want anything to do with that. When we do put it into that barrel, we have to proof it down, meaning we have to lower the proof of the whiskey to no higher than 125 proof. And with bourbon, the only thing you can add to do that is water. And then at some point in the future, because there is no minimal aging period of time for bourbon, we're going to put it into a bottle and it can be no less than 80 proof. And that goes for all styles of whiskeys, right? So there's no minimum aging period. You can age bourbon for 1 second, not good stuff. 20 plus years, start getting a little bit oaky. But if the whiskey, the bourbon is less than 4 years old, you have to put an age statement on the bottle. Anything over 4 years old, totally optional. So that's a little bit of Bourbon 101 for you to set the stage, and hopefully that's enlightened you to what makes bourbon unique. But I know you guys are just dying to dive into this whiskey. So let's go ahead and pull up sample number 1. Now remember, I want you guys to keep your mouth open as you start to smell this, right? So go ahead and lower your nose into the glass and start smelling, taking some good breaths. And what are you picking up on the nose? All right. Once again, there's no wrong answers, but with bourbon, a lot of the traditional flavors you may get are some vanilla, maybe some caramel, maybe a little bit of oak on this one. Okay. And you may get other things as well. You might pick up fruits. You could pick up nut aromas. Once again, there's no wrong answer. When you're ready, let's go ahead and take our first sip. Now, I recommend take a very small sip. Just let it coat the tip of your tongue like this. Let your mouth acclimate. You're going to pick a lot of sweetness up on that front of that tongue, right on those taste buds. Then when you're ready, take a slightly larger sip and let it coat your entire mouth and start thinking about what flavors that you're getting. Now, a quick word, if you're new to drinking high proof spirits, that probably burned a lot. That's okay. It gets better. By sample 3 tonight, as your mouth is acclimated, you're going to have a good time. And if you have any whiskey left, you can repeat the cycle and the loop on your own. The other thing is, if all you're smelling is alcohol in the nose, just breathe into that glass a little bit and try again. And hopefully that will dissipate some of that ethanol smell that you get on the nose. Now, as you taste it, start thinking about, am I getting the flavors that I was picking up on the nose of the whiskey? Do I have that vanilla? Do I have that caramel? Am I getting a little bit of oak? We think about that and we describe that as what we're tasting on the palate. And lastly, with whiskey, you hear people talking about the finish. And the finish is, what do you taste after you swallowed the whiskey? And how long do those flavors last, right? So you'll see someone say it's got a spicy finish and the finish is very short. And that means the finish goes away almost instantly, almost like you're drinking water. You have no residual flavors. A long finish sticks around for a long time. So those are some things to think about. But let me go ahead and unveil what this whiskey is that we're drinking tonight for our first one. This is Wyoming Whiskey Small Batch Bourbon. This is 88 proof, so it's just 8 proof points above the minimum bottle entry proof for a whiskey. This is what we call a wheated bourbon, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. 68% corn, 20% wheat, and 12% malted barley is that mash bill or that grain recipe. And this one actually just started being bottled at 5 years old. So this has been sitting in that barrel for 5 years, which is why if you compare this to like whiskey 2 or 3, is going to be lighter in color. The tasting notes up on the screen, these are provided by the brand because this is the flavor profile that they're trying to hit each and every time they release a batch of their whiskey. Now, this is actually made by a company called Wyoming Whiskey in Kirby, Wyoming. So it's not just a name. And when they started, it was a husband and wife who created this distillery. And instead of learning by trial and error, they brought in the former master distiller from Maker's Mark to help them get the distillery up and running, which is a pretty good indication of why they started with a wheated bourbon, because that's what Maker's Mark is. So if you like Maker's Mark, hopefully you like this one as well. But wheated bourbons are a great choice for a distillery to start with because they tend to reach a more mature flavor profile at a younger age. So if you had more of a traditional bourbon style, it could take a little bit longer to get that flavor that people come to expect from the whiskey. Once again, they use all local grains for this. No GMOs, everything sourced from within Wyoming, which is a tremendous story and a real testament to the quality of the product they want to do. So if you've never had this Wyoming whiskey before, I hope you enjoyed it and you have a good idea of where you can start. I think wheated bourbons are a great place for people who are new to bourbon to dip their toe into it. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. You feel like your bourbon IQ is boosting a little bit, and we'll be back in just a little bit to get into a little bit more bourbon education and a lot more bourbon. See you in a few minutes, folks. Welcome back, folks, and I hope you're ready to move a little bit more into the bourbon tasting round 2. So the first thing I want you guys to do is to make sure you got sample 2 ready, right? But we're going to go ahead and make you start with a little bit more education. You see how I work, right? I'm a little bit of a whiskey tease, if you will. And what I like to start with is this concept of flavor in bourbon and the mash bills, or those grain recipes that we talked about earlier. So the 4 most common grains that go into bourbon and really give it its signature flavor and aroma are going to be corn, barley, rye, and wheat. Once again, we have to have at least 51% corn to be considered qualified to be a bourbon, right? Brings a ton of sweetness to the party, so to speak. We then have barley, which brings a nuttiness and almost like a biscuit quality to the whiskey. It's also really essential because without it, we wouldn't have fermentation. It brings enzymes to the party, and without it, we'd have to use artificial additives, and well, no one wants that in their whiskey. Rye brings a big, bold, spicy flavor characteristic to it and can, in high quantities, even bring a little bit of minty or menthol note, or if you can believe it, pickle. Dill pickle can be present with a lot of rye, or maybe even just a rye whiskey. And then wheat, as you just experienced, brings sweet, soft caramel notes, making a bourbon very approachable. But at the end of the day, the 3 major flavors that you're going to get in bourbon are going to be vanilla, oak, and caramel. So if you ever find yourself at a party, someone hands you a bourbon and you really don't drink bourbon, just smell it, taste it, and say, you know what? That's some delicious vanilla and caramels, kind of like sticky toffee buns that my grandmother used to make, and a little bit of oak, like a good old fashioned camp out. They'll be impressed. You'll be off the hook and you move on. So that's my party trick for you. But what's really cool is if you want to learn how to drink bourbon and how do you decide after you've had a bourbon, where do I go, whether I like the bourbon or not, this concept of mash bills, which are those grain recipes, is really, really important. Now, the caveat being that these mash bills are not written down in any sort of federal standards or code or rule books, and they're even somewhat disputed in the industry themselves, but they will provide you a guide rail, if you will. So when you go to have a whiskey, and you like a whiskey, the first thing to say is, what was the proof? So was it too hot, too much alcohol, too light, just right? What was the age? Was it too young, meaning the bourbon was green and tasted like sawdust? A lot of craft whiskeys can taste that way. Or was it too old, too tannic, really oaky and bitter, right? Or was it just right? Once again, the Goldilocks principle. And then the third thing is, what was the mash bill? The first mash bill to think about is what we call traditional. This is going to have tons of corn, 70 to 80%. It's going to have less than 18% rye in the recipe, and the remainder is that malted barley. And the brands that really exemplify this are Jim Beam, Buffalo Trace, and Wild Turkey, right? This is the traditional bourbon flavor profile that has made it America's native spirit. Wheated bourbons, which you just experienced firsthand, are going to swap out that rye for the wheat. Maker's Mark, Larceny, Rebel, Weller, and the infamous Pappy Van Winkle are all fine examples of a wheated bourbon, right? And then lastly, we have my favorite mash bill, high rye bourbons. We take the wheat out, put the rye back in, but now we're going to push the rye well above 18%, adding big, boldy, spicy characteristics. I not only like drinking that neat, but it is my favorite style of bourbon to put into a whiskey cocktail, because do you know what the first rule of whiskey cocktails are? Well, the first rule is you've got to taste the whiskey, right? If you want a cocktail without any booze flavor, well, that's where vodka comes in, right? But we are whiskey drinkers, or we're trying to be whiskey drinkers, so we want big, bold whiskey flavors. So great examples of that are Old Grandad, Bulleit, Old Forester, Woodford Reserve, and even Four Roses. So learn what the mash bill is of a whiskey. So if you like it, you can find another. If you don't like it, you can avoid that and keep going. Your palate will change over the years as you drink more whiskey. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and move to sample 2. Now, once again, you know the drill. We want to keep that mouth open as you smell this whiskey, right? No reason to lose our sense of smell and taste halfway through. Go ahead and start nosing that whiskey. All right, and I want you to explore it at your own pace. Now, if you look at this whiskey as well, you'll notice it's going to be darker than that first one. And with bourbon, 100% of the color comes from the barrel. There's nothing else can be added but water. So when your whiskey is darker than another one, there's a good chance it's actually older. Then when you smell it, you smell more oak than the first one. Do you smell things like tobacco or leather? On this specific whiskey, on the nose in this one, I get some of that traditional vanilla, a little bit of that toffee note, but I get a lot of oak, I get a lot of leather, and some tobacco. Now, when you taste it, what are you going to get on the palate? Well, for me, that oak comes through strong with some vanilla. I get some leather. Now, how do I know what leather tastes like? Well, before your mind goes there, it's because I played outfield in baseball when I was a child. And when you're in 5th grade, no one's hitting the ball to the outfield. So you got a lot of time to kill. So what do? You chew on your glove. Those little leather tassels, that flavor has stuck in my mind since childhood. And that's why I said you can't smell or taste things that you've never experienced. So if you don't know what leather tastes like, steal your kid's baseball glove, have a little bit of nibble, and now you'll know. But I get that a lot on the palate. But along with that, especially as we get into the finish, well, I start getting a lot of baking spices. So things like cinnamon, nutmeg, bran muffins, things like that. And I also get a little bit of licorice or anise if you want to be fancy about it. I get a little bit of that on the palate. But I think it's a very strong, mature whiskey. Okay. But let me go ahead and share with you what this whiskey is. This is Russell's Reserve 10-year-old bourbon. As the name says, it's 10 years old. This is twice as old as the Wyoming whiskey, which justifies the additional color and the additional oak flavor because we've had more contact with that barrel. 90 proof. So this is only 2 proof points higher than Wyoming. So a lot of times people will drink this one and think it's hotter and has more proof, but it's actually the spices and the oak coming through that confuses and tricks your palate a little bit. It's the traditional bourbon mash bill. So this one specifically is 75% corn, 13% rye, and 12% malted barley. And once again, the tasting notes presented from the brand. What you may not know is this is a wild turkey product. Now, for those of you who are kind of looking at yourselves and wild turkey, I thought only old men, bikers, and badasses drink that whiskey. You're not wrong, because that's how it was marketed for years, because in the 70s and for most of the 80s, nobody was drinking bourbon, so they had to sell it to whomever they could. But the truth is, Wild Turkey is one of the most underrated distilleries in the country. The father and son master distillers who run the operation have combined over 100 years of distilling experience, and their ability to craft a really solid whiskey it's evident in this bottle and all the other brands they put out from Wild Turkey. And what's really cool about it is they only make one bourbon recipe. That's right, one bourbon. When it comes off the still and put it in a barrel, it's one recipe. But from that one recipe, they produce Wild Turkey 81 proof, 101 proof, Russell's Reserve, Kentucky Spirit, Rare Breed, the relatively new Long Branch Wild Turkey, which they did in conjunction with Matthew McConaughey, and then several limited editions each year that they release. They all start the same thing. And that really is going to go into our next section of education, where we talk about the art and, dare I say, magic of barrel aging and how you can take all these barrels of the same liquid and create something unique out of them simply by where you put them into the warehouses and for how long you age them. So if you haven't had Wild Turkey ever, or you haven't had it in a while, I do encourage you to go and try some of their other products. And what you'll find is Wild Turkey has a DNA signature that's very obvious. It's that baking spices that you get. We kind of refer to that as the kickin' chicken, right? It's in every product they make, and some it's more pronounced than others, but it's a nice warming spice that lets you know it's part of the Wild Turkey family. So with that, I hope I've given you a little bit of tools to explore bourbon a little bit further, help you avoid bourbons that you don't like, but most importantly, help you to drink curious. And that's our way of saying, drink what you want, but know why you like something, know why you don't like something, and be brave enough to go out and pick up some more and keep exploring. So keep on sipping. We'll be back in a little bit with a final installment of our Bourbon 101 education and our final sample. Until then, cheers. If you haven't completed all of sample 1 and sample 2, you're not bidding enough. Drink that whiskey, keep bidding, keep donating. It's for a great cause. So that said, let's go ahead and get into our final piece of education. And this is about the art, if you will, and magic of barrel aging, right? Distilling is the science, but really barrel aging and the science behind that charring of that brand new barrel is really, really cool. So this is a little bit of an eye chart. So I'm going to blow it up full screen for you here. But I said earlier, 100% of the color of bourbon comes from the barrel, right? It's because of what the charring does to the barrel. But you should also note that 40 to 70% of the flavor of bourbon comes from the barrel. So no barrel, no bueno, no good, right? We're back to vodka, right? So we're very fortunate to have these barrels, right? But what you may not understand is really what that charring does and why that's so important. Well, the charring helps prepare the barrel to perform its magic on bourbon, right? The first thing is it brings color, right? No char, no color. So it brings color to it. It also increases the surface area of the barrel. So if you've never seen the inside of a barrel before, this is what the actual inside looks like. That char, right, brings out all these nooks and crannies, which increases the surface area. So you have a 53-gallon barrel chock full of liquid, right, pressing up against the wood, and these nooks and crannies give more exposure to it. The next thing is that charring prepares that wood and changes it chemically, right? The first thing is it takes the hemicellulose, right? This is your science education dollars at work, and breaks it down into wood sugars, right? And that's where we're going to get those flavors of caramel and toffee that we love so much in bourbon. And then we also break down the lignin, and we break that down into vanillin, which is where we get those classic vanilla notes that really makes bourbon so unique. And when that whiskey has been sitting in that barrel for 6 years or so, we get really rich vanillas, and that's where things get really exciting. And then it's just simply drawing those sugars closer to the surface. So what happens is these barrels, right, they sit in these warehouses. And if you've ever seen a warehouse before, it's a multi-story building, right? It's clad in metal, no insulation, with windows at the top and bottom for heat control. So it gets really hot in the summers, and that liquid has to expand. So it expands through that charred layer. Between the char and the bare wood is the sugar, the red line, which is the caramelized sugars. And then beyond that is the bare wood. So you start picking up those flavors from the red line, get the tannics, the oak from the bare wood. But that char layer is what we call a subtractive layer. And it works just like charcoal works, right? It removes a lot of the bad esters and flavor components that you don't want in your bourbon, like sulfur. Think of it as sandpaper, smoothing out the rough edges. And then it goes through that red line, picking up color, picking up sweet flavors, gets into that wood again, picks up those oaky, smoky vanillas and tannins. Then when it gets cold, the liquid contracts, pulls back through, repeating the process. And this happens over and over again throughout the seasons, which is why Kentucky is such a fantastic place to age bourbon, right? 1 year of aging in Kentucky is roughly equivalent to 3 years aging in Scotland because of the difference in climates. Now, that's what's going on in the barrels. But because of that design of that warehouse, the top floors get super, super hot, right? Over 100 degrees. So the barrels at the top of a warehouse, or rick house as they're referred to in Kentucky, gets really aggressive. They age quickly. The water evaporates off quickly. then the alcohol starts to evaporate. And when that's in the air, we call that the angel's share. When you walk into a warehouse, it absolutely smells amazing, and you will absolutely never bring a lit cigarette into a warehouse because it's, well, alcohol is in the air, right? But as a result, those barrels are very aggressively aged, high proof, lots of evaporation, very intense whiskey. At the extreme other end, on the bottom floors, it's much cooler. The temperature is going to be in the 70s. Those barrels age more gracefully, right? Instead of mass evaporation, they may actually draw moisture in from the surrounding air, thereby lowering the proof, right? So if a barrel comes into the warehouse and it is at 125 proof, right, maximum barrel entry, those top floors, when that whiskey gets harvested for bottling, could be 145 proof, really hot, spicy stuff. Whereas on the bottom floor, because it's pulling in moisture, those barrels can be down to 105, 110 proof, right? So, and then you have everything in between on those floors, right? Aging at different levels, different intensities. So suddenly you've got a lot of barrels to draw from, right? A large warehouse in Kentucky has 50 to 60,000 barrels in it, and the larger distilleries can have 30 to 60 of those warehouses. So you have a lot of barrels to choose from. And I kind of call it's kind of like taking two second graders, right? Both have the same drawing ability, but one has an 8-pack of crayons and the other one has a pack of 64 crayons. Well, the 64 crayons will always have the edge in the variations and the expressiveness they can put into their drawings, right? And it's like that with bourbon. When you have all these barrels and you learn all the nuances of each warehouse, how they age, how the whiskey tastes, you can then draw from that collection of barrels and craft really, really unique and innovative bourbon products. And that's why distilleries like Wild Turkey can have one recipe, but create multiple brand expressions that taste different, not just from a proof perspective, but actual the flavor is different. And that's why I call it the art and magic of barrel aging. So if you've never been down to visit a distillery in Kentucky and get into a warehouse, put it on your list, make sure you get it done. And if you have a friend that owns a liquor store or a restaurant, talk to them about doing what we call a private barrel selection, where you go down with them to Kentucky and you actually pick your own barrel, because then you get to go into the warehouse in many places and actually drink directly from the barrel. And well, that's a bucket list item for just about anyone. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and jump into our final sample number 3. Now, by now, you know the drill, right? So go ahead and pick up that glass. Keep that nose open and give it a smell. Now, if you're paying attention, you're going to notice that this one seems a little bit different, okay? What is it about this whiskey that's different on the nose? Well, for me, this one is remarkably sweet, almost dessert forward, right? You've got rich aromas on this one. There's a lot of dark fruit, think things like prunes and raisins. Okay, you still got the vanilla and caramel in there. Okay, maybe a little bit of cocoa chocolate, if you will. And this comes from a family of distilleries that everything they make, the thing that I smell, well, ripe bananas, like banana bread, if you will. So it's one of the distilleries that if I have one of their products, you usually tell who made it because of that. On the palate, let's see. This one really is lovely, in my opinion. You're going to get those dark fruits coming through, right? Very sweet, almost a rum raisin-esque type of flavor profile. The bananas are there, but then you're also going to pick up other fruit and spices as well. But it's very, very silky on the palate. And like I said, very dessert forward. Doesn't taste like anything else we drank this evening, which is kind of cool, right? A lot of people think bourbon is one-dimensional. But most people don't sit down with 2 or 3 or 4 samples next to each other where they can actually compare and contrast. So fortunate for you to be able to do that this evening and really kind of see the broad range available with bourbons. Now the finish on this one, well, I think I need another sip. Long, creamy, lingering, right? Very delicious. Let me go ahead and share with you what this whiskey is. This is Woodford Reserve Double Oaked. This is 90.4 proof, okay? This is a high rye bourbon, so it has that higher rye content in it. 18% of the content is rye, to be precise. And there's no age statement on this. This whiskey actually starts its life as Woodford Reserve bourbon, And then when it's ready, they take it out and put it into another brand new barrel that before it's charred, it is toasted. And that toasting brings out a nice light marshmallow flavor with some chocolate dusting notes as well that radically transforms Woodford Reserve into this very dessert forward whiskey. Now, this one, I like to pair it with desserts. I like to sip it neat. And I tell you, don't be afraid to play with your food. If you get served something like some banana pudding or whatnot, don't just drink this with it. Pour it on your dessert. Oh my God, it's amazing. Get some creme brulee, pour it into the creme brulee. It's absolutely delicious. There's a lot of things you could do with your whiskey. So that's the last sample. But before I sign off for this evening, I want to let you guys know you've been such a great group sitting, drinking whiskey with me. And I think everyone should be rewarded for putting up with me and my bad jokes. I'm going to make sure each and every one of you get a free code to download our digital templates for hosting your own tasting. So if you're inspired by tonight and want to show off your new bourbon IQ level, or you just want to get together with friends, whether virtually or in person, you'll have the templates and the tools to print out some tasting mats of your own design and host a bourbon tasting. So look for that soon from the event organizers. We will be heading your way. And lastly, feel free to quickly snap a photo of this screen. This is my personal email address. I like to make myself available. I don't get enough time in the day to talk whiskey. So if you ever have a question, whether from tonight's presentation, want to host your own tasting, or just want to talk whiskey, drop me an email. I'll be happy to respond. Just don't email me while you're in the store trying to make a purchase decision. I'm just not that fast. And well, I'm not going to give out my mobile number. But I really appreciate you hanging tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the whiskeys. Those of you who aren't bourbon drinkers, maybe you'll consider becoming one. Those who are bourbon drinkers, maybe you found a new favorite. But more than anything, I hope that you've kind of picked up on the spirit of drinking curious and staying interested and learning about things as you go. And if I can help inspire that just a little bit, I'm really, really privileged to have had the chance to do that. So thank you once again for having me this evening to lead you through your tasting. I wish you all the greatest success with this event and what you guys are doing for the children. And thank you so much. And remember, folks, if you're going to drink, remember to drink curious. Cheers.